Good afternoon and welcome to the inaugural 2022 Fall Forum presented by Rebuilding Hope, Sexual Assault Center for Pierce County. We're so glad to have each of you joining us today, whether you are here in person at the University of Washington Tacoma campus, virtually through the university's YouTube channel live stream, or if you are watching this recording. My name is Robert Marshall Wells, and I will be serving as the host during today's program. I'm the Director of Communications for Elevate Health, the accountable community of health organization for Pierce County. Elevate Health's mission is to build and drive community coalitions that transform health systems and advance whole person health for all. One of our core roles is connecting individuals who need care in our community to the local organizations that can offer support. For those reasons, I'm honored to be here with you today and delighted to help facilitate this important community event. Now we'll hear a land acknowledgement.
Ti duf ti swatwiftud tish poyalapaj, a slasil, altidisha to alturi tuha.
It is the land right here that the Puyallup people have lived on since the beginning.
This
right here is where we are in the world, our homelands.
Uyayus chas alti swatwiftud atish tu ishachas. Ukachachas tis badadachas. Uoch twati chalalt alti swatwiftud atis poyalapaj.
We work on our ancestral lands. We raise our children who go to school on the land of the Puyallup people.
Oheg chas ti shwananam tliti, ohashitab ti pasted okwaredu.
We acknowledge that the Medicine Creek Treaty was signed for the whites to take our land for their benefit.
Ohashitab chas ati shwananam tliti ati swatwiftud chas. Otuk ti pasted squat lup swatwiftud lup.
Land was assigned to our people. The Caucasians said, "This is your land," and they took that land from us too.
Okararitub chas atiswat chas. Odzak atab tis tliti.
Our land was stolen from us. Treaties were broken.
Toch didi chas altis lachel.
But we are still here today.
Hui chata tu quailin chata tu ish chata tu alalos chata tu tol shotsidam.
Our people forage for food and materials, we pick berries, we canoe, we practice our traditional ways, and we speak Twelshutsi.
Just as our ancestors did.
Hoya chas.
We are finished.
We offer a humble acknowledgement to the original tribes whose lands were stolen from them that we have the privilege to reside and work on today, as well as the duty to preserve and protect. The Rebuilding Hope office rests on lands originally belonging to the Puyallup tribe, and we work to serve community members across the Pierce County area that for thousands of years had been the original territory and home of the Puyallup, Nisqually, Squaxin, Island, and Muckleshoot people. If Rebuilding Hope upholds our mission to facilitate support and healing for victims of a physical violation, we must atone for the collective violation of the Native people and lands which we endeavor to mutually share and protect with the descendants of those tribes. This forum is brought to you today on behalf of a very special collaboration between 4 local organizations that work together to educate, prevent, and respond to a variety of forms of violence that occur in our communities daily. From child abuse to sexual assault to domestic violence to human trafficking, Rebuilding Hope, Washington Trafficking Prevention, our Sister's House, and the Crystal Judson Family Justice Center are available to you and your community, offering trauma-informed education, advocacy, resources, healing services, and system coordination. Each of these organizations offer resource tables in the Columbia Bank Gallery behind the stage just outside these doors. If you haven't done so already, please be sure to visit them and get more information about what they do and how you might receive support from them or become involved in their work. Also, we wish to thank the University of Washington Tacoma's Office of Community Partnerships for supporting this forum, for offering this physical space in which we convened, and for their gracious hospitality in welcoming us, and for the Information Technology Services team making this event accessible to many in attendance today, as well as those who will access it in the future. Now, a few words about instructions for reaching technical support and assistance for those who are watching online. The content of this presentation and program will reference depictions, descriptions, and discussion of the impacts of multiple forms of violence and trauma, including but not limited to sexual assault and abuse, rape, family violence, child abuse, molestation, trafficking, physical violence, domestic violence, sexism, misogyny, race and racism, colonization, and suicide. This program is not recommended for viewers under the age of 12. Rebuilding Hope will offer participants multiple options to connect with a confidential advocate should you be in need of support or assistance during the program. Please show yourself care and compassion during the program and consider taking breaks from viewing however you can. Viewer and parental discretion is advised. Rebuilding Hope wishes to offer options for any members of the live in-person audience, virtual or recording viewer audiences to access confidential support during or after this program. If you find any of the material from today's program triggering and wish to receive support here on site, Rebuilding Hope offers 2 confidential advocates who are here in the audience, 2 young ladies in the back of the room, just waving there. You may seek them out at any time, and they will step out with you for a private conversation outside the building here, outside the offices or the room. If you are joining virtually and you wish to speak with a confidential advocate, you may either contact Rebuilding Hope's 24-hour hotline at 253-474-7273. Visit Rebuilding Hope's website and utilize the online chat with an advocate feature, or email, and there's the email there, advocacy@hopesacpc.org. If you or a loved one decide later that you wish to seek support, keep in mind that Rebuilding Hope serves all survivors of any form of sexual violence, whether it happened hours ago or decades ago. Survivors or their loved ones of any age can reach out anonymously to the 24-hour hotline and online chat for confidential support. Survivors ages 13 and over are eligible for sexual assault and abuse trauma-focused counseling services, and anyone can receive information and referrals for specialized support and services in Pierce County related to sexual assault and abuse. Rebuilding Hope is here for you and will connect you with other partners and community organizations to ensure you receive a comprehensive foundation of support following trauma. It's now my distinct honor to introduce today's keynote speaker. Dr. Carolyn M. West is Professor of Clinical Psychology in the School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences, an affiliate professor in the Department of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies, and a resident fellow in the Office of Community Partnerships at the University of Washington. She's a nationally recognized Black feminist scholar who investigates gender-based violence in the lives of African American women with a focus on domestic violence, sexual assault, and sexual harassment. Dr. West has authored more than 70 academic publications and is editor-contributor of Violence in the Lives of Black Women, Battered Black and Blue. She's the winner of the American Psychological Association's Carolyn Payton Early Career Award. She has taught courses on sex crimes and sexual violence, family violence, and the psychology of Black women for more than 30 years. When she was a graduate student activist, Dr. West successfully filed a sexual harassment lawsuit. She has since used her personal experiences and extensive academic background to work as an expert witness in legal cases. She has conducted hundreds of workshops, keynote addresses, and training seminars. Dr. West's subspecialties include racism in pornography and the psychological impact of stereotypes on African American women. She is writer, producer of a documentary titled Let Me Tell Y'all About Black Chicks, Images of Black Women in Pornography. Based on Dr. West's groundbreaking content analysis of more than 4,000 adult film covers and decades of developing compelling slide presentations, it is a searing illustrated multimedia presentation that explores the historical origins of these images and helps the viewer to identify how racial stereotypes in pornography promote sexual violence against Black girls and women. Dr. West's work on sexualized media images has been featured in Essence Magazine and NBC News. She has been quoted in the New York Times and the Washington Post regarding high-profile cases of sexual violence. She also has appeared on NPR and Free Speech TV. Dr. West earned a PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Missouri. She completed a clinical and teaching postdoctoral fellowship at Illinois State University and a postdoctoral research fellowship in family violence research at the University of New Hampshire's Family Research Laboratory. She is the recipient of the University of Washington's 2013 Distinguished Teaching Award, a 2016 Distinguished Research Award, and the Bartley Dobb Professorship for Study and Prevention of Violence, 2005 through 2008. You can find more information and contact Dr. West directly by visiting www.drcarolynwest.com. Before we bring her up, however, we would like to first share with you a piece of Dr. West's story.
Precious Lord, take my hand. I am the great-granddaughter and granddaughter of sharecroppers. They were proud and hardworking people who planted and harvested rows and rows of cotton in the rich Arkansas soil. They were sustained by their faith and their family. I'm the granddaughter of Moselle Stevenson. Gospel music, Mahalia Jackson, Precious Lord, take my hand. Grandma Moselle hummed softly as she stirred her big pot of collard greens, sweet potato pies cooling on the counter, big fancy hats that the church mothers call Sunday crowns. Me in my patent leather shoes, holding Grandma's hand as we went to church. Grandma left Arkansas on a segregated railroad car and moved to St. Louis. She grew rows and rows of roses in our stately Victorian home that was more than 100 years old. In me, she cultivated a fierce independence and a deep desire for knowledge. She was my superhero and protector. She was strong. She ended every conversation with, "Be sweet, baby." During the week, she worked at a hospital, transporting patients and helping in the operating recovery room. I wanted to help people too. I wanted to teach my grandpa George to read and write. I wanted to understand why he was so sad and why being a Black man in America made him so angry, that he hurt Grandma Moselle, my mother, and me. I left the old Victorian house in St. Louis to go to school. Then the call came. It was cancer. The last night, friends and 3 generations of family members crowded into her bedroom. In the closet, her big fancy hats. I held her hand. She quietly passed with grace and dignity as she had lived. There was a whirlwind of activity as we prepared for her homegoing services. Grandma wore a white suit and a white hat Her casket was light heavenly blue, gospel music, Mahalia Jackson, Precious Lord, take my hand. I'm tired, I'm weak, I'm alone. Through the storm, through the night, lead me to the light. Take my hand, precious Lord, lead me home. We sang and we sang. At home, a big pot of collard greens on the stove, sweet potato pies cooling on the counter. Now I'm a university professor. I plant and harvest ideals and books. I write about domestic violence, sexual assault, and intergenerational trauma. I try to understand how my grandma Moselle was so resilient and why my grandpa George was so sad. I stay grounded. I'm the great-granddaughter and granddaughter of sharecroppers.
And now it's my distinct pleasure to welcome Dr. Carolyn M. West. Dr. West.
We all have a story. And there were many things actually that brought me here today to talk to you. And as we kind of go through this presentation, think about your stories. Because oftentimes we know somebody who's a survivor. It could be a friend, a coworker, family member, it could be ourselves. A couple of pivotal points brought me here. I remember I was 13 years old, and it was a Saturday morning, and I was armed with my first adult library card. That was power. And I could walk into the library at that point, and I didn't have to stay in the little kid section. I could check out like real books that didn't just have pictures in them. So I was super excited. And I remember going into the library, and the first book that I checked out was a book. It was a Cabanne Branch library, and it just seemed like the most massive building in the world to me. And I walked in, and the first book that I checked out was a book called Scream Quietly or the Neighbors Will Hear. It was 1977, and it was the first sort of academic book that dealt with domestic violence. And I just was captivated because I started to think, well, I want to know more about this topic, and how can I learn more? How can I do more to combat this problem? You know, I was 13, I was ahead of my time. So that was a pivotal event for me. And a couple of other pivotal events that really shaped my life on this particular journey was around the time I was 13, I found the Encyclopedia World Book, Boys and Girls. That was before like the internet, for those of you who are a little bit my students' age. And I found the entry for clinical psychologists, and I just intuitively knew that that's what I should be doing with the rest of my life. That's what I wanted to do when I grew up. So I'm 22, so imagine this, I'm 22 years old, and I'm in graduate school working on my PhD. And I learned from that, I learned a lot of things from that experience, but one thing I learned is that you don't have to be a clinical psychologist to be a helper. in that way, that any of us will always encounter survivors in the work that we do. And we have to be prepared to help them. So imagine that experience. You go into your office after you leave here, or you go back to your daily life, and you know that person, you know they have something, you know that look that people have, they want to tell you something, but they're looking at you and they're trying to decide, can I trust this person? I'll move on. Can I trust this person? I've got something that's weighing on my heart, and I need to share this, but I don't know if I can trust them with this thing that I have to share. And they look at you and they say to you, so would you feel comfortable lying on my desk? Yeah, that's what I said too. But that's how it started. That's what he said to me. How would you help? Could you listen? Could you show compassion? Could you be available to that person and really believe what they were saying? Or would you shut them down? I learned from that experience that anybody could be a helper, that you can make the difference between helping that person and them trusting you and them getting the help that they need, or them shutting down and never sharing that story again. And that was my experience in graduate school. I actually learned from that time that gender-based violence thrives on silence, secrecy, and shame. And perpetrators count on us being silent about those things. I also learned that not only can anybody be a helper, I also learned this. I learned that perpetrators are all around us, and they could be anybody. We oftentimes don't see the perpetrators because this particular individual often wore these button-down white shirts. He seemed so, you didn't question him, but we all knew, and we never had those conversations. But he was, he was a psychologist, he was a professor, he seemed all put together, but he was also a sex offender, and he was also a rapist, and he was also a sexual harasser pervert. That was just my nickname for him. He was all of those things. And so we all knew, but as a community of students, we didn't talk about it. And nobody wanted to sort of tell. And so I learned the importance of a voice and also sharing those secrets as a way to combat all forms of gender-based violence. So since I'm sitting here with a bunch of my closest friends, I'll tell you what actually happened. We ended up as a group of students complaining about it, and it culminated in a lawsuit that was filed, and we actually won. But in the course of that lawsuit, it gave me a chance to talk to the media and to work with the university to change policy around sexual assault. So I learned that there were a lot of brave people out there who will stand with you when you raise these issues. So I learned a lot from graduate school, which then took me on to the University of Notre Dame, where I finished my dissertation on dating violence among African American adolescents. And I selected that topic because I figured if we could stop dating violence before it turned into marital violence, then maybe we could get ahead of the problem. And I wanted to focus on Black kids in particular because I knew that that was a particular vulnerable population. So did that, finished the dissertation, I got my degree, I was happy to leave. They were happy for me to leave. spent some time at Illinois State. I thought I was going to be a clinical psychologist and do clinical practice, and realized that I loved teaching just so much more. So ended up going to the University of New Hampshire. And remember the book that I mentioned to you, Scream Quietly or the Neighbors Will Hear? Well, this gentleman, Murray Strauss, was one of the researchers in that book. I didn't realize that at the age of 13, when I picked that book up, that I would fast forward many years later and end up working in his lab as his assistant and as his postdoc. And so that was an incredible experience. And we spent 2 years fighting about all forms of gender-based violence. And I learned just from that experience that the master's tools may not dismantle the master's house, but you need to have some of the master's tools in your toolbox so that I would have the skills to be able to argue my point effectively. So we never agreed on much of anything, but it was an important experience nevertheless. And so that brought me to actually, after my postdoc at New Hampshire, my sister said to me, she said, "So, Carolyn, why don't you try something different now, like getting a job?" I said, "Yeah, I guess I should do that." So I found my way to the University of Washington here in Tacoma. And the first thing I did was develop courses on family violence and sexual assault. And then started working with the Office of Community Partnerships. And I realized as I was doing this work, as I interacted with all the amazing students and faculty members here, I realized that my mission needed to be to create inspirational material to empower domestic violence and sexual assault survivors during their healing journey, to deliver keynote addresses, conduct workshops, and customize innovative training material to educate professionals so that they could have the skills to be more culturally responsive. And that I needed to empower, educate, and inspire a multicultural alliance of survivors and professionals to prevent all forms of violence and to help survivors heal themselves. So when I wake up in the morning, I'm never confused about what I'm going to be doing. That really has become the mission and the vision for my life. And so as we kind of go through this time together, think about what your mission and vision can be. Because it doesn't matter what your major is or what your profession is, we're all going to encounter survivors. And we have to be prepared to help them in some capacity or another. And so that's why we're here. And I realized too, I needed to break down the walls between the academy and the community. And I didn't realize at the time that maybe I had a superpower. And that superpower was to use the research that I was creating to work with judges, jury members, and the community to do education about what it means for survivors to meet the challenge that they're meeting. So I started working with women who had used domestic violence, had killed their intimate partners, and then started educating, going into the court. Well, actually, just lawyers started to call me and ask, "Can you help?" And I was like, "I don't know. I'm just a professor. I'm just like in my office minding my own business, but I guess." And I realized that I could use that to put that knowledge together in a way that could help survivors not end up in prison for decades if they didn't really need to. So here's one lawyer who contacted me, and we actually worked with a woman who had shot her husband in the back 6 times, and to really educate the jury members about why and how that happened, and how that was a way of really making real difference in the lives of the community that I wanted so much to serve. And as I reflect on being at UWT for 25 years now, I came in 1997, I realized how much this community has actually poured into me as a person and as a scholar. In 2003, it was April, Crystal Judson was murdered by her husband, who was a police chief in Tacoma. We rallied as a community. And in record time, this is Susan Adams and Craig Robert. Really, we were so young back then. I don't know what happened. But we rallied and started the Family Justice Center, which is now still going strong. And it was a one-stop shop where you could go, survivors can go and not have to run around all over town and get the services that they need. So I learned the importance and the power of community to gather and to make real differences. I've worked a lot with Rebuilding Hope. It's been my honor to work with them, and that has inspired me actually to develop a course on sexual violence and sex crimes from the work that I was doing with them, because I knew that sexual violence was something people were very reluctant to talk about. The work that I've done with Washington trafficking prevention, understanding that trafficking is it's a problem throughout the Pierce County community and Washington state, has been very impactful. And also our Sisters House, the work that they're doing, and this information should be out front, tables in the back, and specifically culturally specific organizations that help African American women and how important that is, and now learning more about Elevate Health and understanding that this is a health problem that we're dealing with. These are all health problems. And they're not intimate partner violence, gender-based violence, not just personal problems, but real health problems. And so understanding that has been huge. And so what I'm learning is that we need to stop being so siloed in our own little worlds, just kind of doing this work within our own organizations and making sure that we're talking to each other and understanding that all these forms of violence intersect and interact. So that's going to be critical. So why this particular type of violence? Why do we need to look at communities of color specifically? Well, this is why. Oftentimes when we do this work, we start with that familiar tagline that says, domestic violence impacts everybody regardless of race, ethnicity, social class. To a certain extent, that is certainly true. But it's also true that communities of color are disproportionately impacted by all these forms of violence that we're going to talk about. So as I was writing my book, Violence in the Lives of Black Women, Battered Black and Blue, I realized what we really need to do is how can we articulate the similarities across all ethnic and social groups without erasing those important experiences. But how can we then talk about ethnic and racial differences without reinforcing the very stereotypes that we're seeking to avoid? And so there's no simple answer to doing that, but I think the way we can best do it is by taking an intersectional approach. And intersectionality, just basically simply, Kimberly Crenshaw, a legal scholar, she talked about an intersectional framework for understanding multiple aspects of our identity and how those things, how we can be both privileged simultaneously and disadvantaged. It's a way of really arguing that we need to understand that people don't have just a race or a gender or a sexual orientation. You have all of those things that are combined in very complex ways. And if we want to really do this work, Intersectionality is basically bringing what is intersectionality? All of who I am. It is bringing all of who you are to the table in whatever work you do with survivors. So we're asking survivors, when they bring all of who they are to the table, we've got to see that and allow them to identify the parts of themselves that are most important to them. But as providers who want to help, we've got to bring all of ourselves to the table too. And that's why I started off with the intro video, because I realized being the granddaughter and great-granddaughter of sharecroppers has shaped who I am. Not just being a psychologist, but coming from those working class roots, and how has that shaped my experience in the work that I do. So we have to take an intersectional approach. Here's another way of just kind of thinking about this. I mean, these are not all of our identities, these are just some of our identities. And they overlap in complex ways. So we have a sexual orientation, we maybe have an immigration status, we are differently abled, we have a race or ethnicity, we have a social class, or any other identities that you can think. What else is not here? I was going to say faith. People come from different faith backgrounds. Oh, yeah, for sure. Age. Age, yeah. Age is a fact. That's going to shape how you experience intimate partner violence. Maybe mental health status. I'm finding even people in the military, that's a whole different kind of experience. So we all have different experiences, and all of those are going to we have to ask, how does that shape intimate partner violence, how you experience it, how society responds to you when you experience it. And so if we really want to do this work effectively, we have to be intersectional in everything that we do. Now, let's talk broadly. For people who are new to the domestic violence field and aren't really familiar with this, we talk about gender-based violence. We often start with like a power and control wheel. And that's important to understand that it's not just physical and sexual violence, but it's all the other forms of power and control that impact survivors. I always explain to my students, oftentimes all this other power and control behavior happens before the physical and the sexual and the psychological violence happens. So it's really common for perpetrators to use intimidation, various forms of emotional abuse. They'll isolate. I think one particular thing, isolating the victim. They'll minimize, they'll deny the abuse, they'll use children, we say male privilege, but again, that terminology is problematic, because what about people who are trans individuals? What about people who are in same-sex relationships? So it doesn't necessarily capture, and that's where intersectionality comes in. We're not maybe seeing every person in this power and control wheel. They use economic abuse, they use coercion, they use threats. This is a common way that we kind of conceptualize intimate partner violence. But if we're going to do this work and do it well, we need to widen the lens. And we need to see certain types of violence that are disproportionately impacting communities of color that don't get talked about. And so I'm going to give you some examples that I'm finding in my own research of violence involving communities of color that we sort of overlook, but that are still really, really harmful. So we know that women of color in particular, and I'll talk about each one of these more in turn, are disproportionately impacted by non-fatal strangulation. What we're now understanding is a unique type of sexual violence called reproductive coercion, domestic homicide, and they're disproportionately more likely to be what we call victim defendants. And we're seeing a lot of that. So I'll talk some about that and some ways to kind of deal with that. And maybe you also can think about other forms of violence that disproportionately impact communities of color here that need to be addressed, because I'm sure that there are many. But let's talk about non-fatal strangulation. Did you know that non-fatal strangulation, again, it sometimes gets overlooked. We're learning more about this. We don't talk enough about it. And the literature is really unclear about why women of color are more likely to be strangled by intimate partners. But when we look at the research, a disturbing racial disproportionality we're finding with particularly Black women, but also Latinas and Native women are more likely to be strangled by intimate partners than other ethnic groups. And we have to start asking why that is, because that's a potentially lethal form of violence. It could be used just once to effectively silence the victim so that she doesn't report the violence. So it's very, very damaging, and is also a risk factor of domestic homicide. So that's a really lethal, potentially lethal form of violence that we're seeing. Another form of violence that disproportionately impacts women of color is what we now understand to be reproductive coercion. Reproductive coercion. So it can happen anytime during the course of the relationship, but what it does is the perpetrator will do things like they will use pregnancy pressure. They'll pressure the survivor to become pregnant when it's really not a good time for them to become pregnant, so they will refuse to negotiate condom use, for example, or they will pressure or coerce the survivor to continue a pregnancy. It's like, I really want you to have this baby. So it's not really what the survivor is wanting, but the perpetrator is compelling the survivor to do that. They'll do things like sabotage birth control, so remove the condom without the survivor's knowledge, or throw away birth control is very common. And they'll try to control pregnancy outcomes. So things like, well, if you don't terminate this pregnancy, I'll leave you. If you terminate this pregnancy, I'll kill you. So they will try to control the pregnancy outcomes for the survivor. So this is a very powerful way of controlling, because with that pregnancy, it makes it more difficult perhaps to leave and to escape a violent situation. So women of color are disproportionately impacted by this. And regardless of sort of where you stand on the Dobbs decision, what will this mean as we are struggling as a country? Who has access to even things like birth control, or who has access to abortion? What will that mean for survivors? And we're going to have to grapple with that as a community, because it's here now. And so we'll have to figure out how to best support survivors as they deal and make space for them to talk about the reproductive coercion that's existing in their lives. And women of color will be disproportionately impacted by this. We also know that women of color, particularly Black and Native women, are at more elevated risk for domestic homicides. On average, about 3 to 4 women are murdered somewhere in this country every day. And we're seeing certainly an uptick in that in our Pierce County community, just horrifyingly so. But we tend to overlook that kind of violence unless it's a mass shooting. We get very upset, as justifiably so, with mass shootings, but we don't see the everyday homicides that happen that get overlooked. And a disproportionate number of them are women of color. This report is published every year when men murder women. And every year the findings are the same, that Black women are disproportionately murdered at record rates more than any other ethnic group. And so that is something that we have to face head on if we want to be more culturally sensitive in the work that we do. And we also know that survivor defendants are overrepresented in the work that we do. We know that battered women, what we call survivor defendants, what ends up happening is once you are in a situation where you're experiencing domestic violence, what will happen is oftentimes survivors will then fight back in self-defense. And so they end up becoming arrested at record rates. And what that means, so they get arrested because they're using violence in self-defense, and a disproportionate number of them will be women of color. And why is that? Oftentimes they are getting arrested at record rates because they don't trust the legal system. And I'll talk about that a little bit more after the break, what is going on when they don't trust the legal system to help on their behalf. And so they end up using violence to fight back. So they're fighting back more. So women of color will tend to use physical force to resist the violence rather than calling the police. Oftentimes their partners are using serious violence against them. And we also know that survivor defendants are what we called abused aggressors. So it looks like, well, it looks like it's just bi-directional violence. Both people are using violence, both people are the problem. But really what we're finding is that oftentimes women of color are what we call abuse aggressors. Maybe if you don't have other ways of learning how to resolve conflict, you resolve conflict by using violence yourself. So we need to understand really what we're seeing is what we call asymmetric bidirectional violence. So in other words, both parties are using violence, but it's not an equal fight. And so when the police show up, they start to believe that, well, I'm going to arrest this person, they're the primary aggressor, and they really shouldn't be arrested. We need to be stepping back, and then we need to see, is there something else going on in this person's life? Are they really using violence in self-defense? Or is there something else going on? And then how can we offer them services? So now we're getting to the point where we're seeing we're calling them survivor defendants and doing more on their behalf. So to learn more about that, we need, here's a really great resource called Criminalizing Survivors. And so I would really recommend that. And so we'll go ahead. Do you want to do an intermission now? Okay. 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 But I'll make this point before that we take our intermission, and then we'll take our intermission at 2. I think what I would leave you with is one thing I've learned about this work is that we also need to focus on primary prevention. We need to focus on stopping the violence before it starts. So Frederick Douglass said, "It is easier to build strong children than to repair broken men." It's easier to build strong children than it is to repair broken men, or I would say broken humans. So it's better if we work together as a community to prevent all forms of violence before it starts. And the second thing I would say is we oftentimes think about that Service Pro line, they say, like it never even happened. And we take that perspective when we deal with trauma in our society. We're going to just act like it never even happened. Well, what we're learning now, and I've learned as a trauma psychologist in doing this work, life just doesn't work like that way. You can't just treat trauma and violence as it never even happened, because it did. It changes your biology, it changes your worldview. So really what we need to start doing is to take a different approach to dealing with trauma, I would argue. I would argue that one thing I've learned about doing this work actually is that I learned from the experience in graduate school, I learned about resilience. And I learned about all the ways that I became remarkably resilient after having dealt with a fair amount of trauma as I was making my way through graduate school. And I think that we need to start seeing survivors in our community as remarkably resilient people and figuring how we can build on that resilience rather than seeing them as profoundly, permanently damaged in some ways. So I've learned a lot about resilience along the way. And I've also learned a term, who's heard the term kintsugi? It's a type of art, Japanese art form, but it's also an important life philosophy. And the message is, I'm trying to apply that to my own life as I do this work, that instead of taking the Service Pro approach, like life happens and we're gonna pretend like there's no damage, I'm gonna embrace kintsugi. And that is a Japanese art form. It's a type of repairing broken pottery. So instead of taking a pot that's been broken and throwing away and seeing it as permanently damaged, what artists started to do was they would take those broken pieces and they would use gold and other precious material to put the pot back together and make an even more beautiful piece of art. And that's what we need to be doing when we work with trauma survivors. Instead of seeing them as permanently broken, how can we help people take those shattered pieces of their lives, pull it back together, and create something more beautiful? And as I reflect on this, I realize that's what we did with the Justice Center. We took a community tragedy and we figured out a way, how can we pick up the pieces as individuals and as a community and create something even more amazing, which was a Justice Center, which was a one-stop place. And so along the journey, the whole notion of creating something better and seeing resilience and beauty in that tragedy can move a community forward. And so we're going to take a break because what I love most about Kintsugi is understanding our scars are what makes us beautiful. So after the break, we're going to have like a 10-minute break or so, get some questions, and I'll be answering your questions, and then we'll be talking about what we can do as a community to move forward and create just a more beloved community where we as a larger body can move together and to address intimate partner violence and all forms of gender-based violence in our community. So thanks.
All right, we're going to take a 10-minute break. We'll come back at 2:10 p.m. For those of you in our live in-person audience here, you'll see some note cards and some pens on your table. If you have some questions you would like to submit for Dr. West to answer later on when we come back from break, go ahead and write down those questions. And we have some staff here. We have Gabby over here, raise your hand. Christina in the back, raise your hand. Just hand them your note cards with questions in the next couple of minutes, and we'll be getting those organized when we come back for the Q&A. Okay, thank you so much. grab your seats, and I'm just going to give Zach a minute to get us switched over back to the live program. Okay, thank you.
Are we good to go? Good to go? Okay, great. So we're back. I understand that there are some questions that have been teed up by Rebuilding Hope, and then we also have some questions from the audience as well as we move into our Q&A period. So the first one, what does the most current research and data, representing only what's reported, tell us about the disproportionate experiences Black people and people of color have as it relates to child abuse, physical, sexual, etc., domestic violence, intimate partner violence, sexual violence, reproductive coercion, control, and commercial sexual exploitation?
Okay, so what the research tells us, it's really a complicated question.
Yes. There are 5 or 6 questions within that one question. But that's, you know, that's
what we know is that if you do look at the research, we know that all these forms of violence can impact people across ethnic backgrounds, no question about that. But at the same time, we know that people of color are also disproportionately impacted. But I think it's important not to just leave it at that, because then, as I said, we don't want to reinforce the stereotype that people of color are just inherently more violent. A number of factors may be contributing to that, how the research is conducted, if the samples that we use are appropriate, if the way we measure violence. There are sometimes problems with that don't capture the full range of the experiences of people of color.
Right.
So I just like to say yes, but here's more to it. And I'll unpack that later in other questions. But we do know people of color are disproportionately overrepresented. And that really is not about inherently your color or your culture. Mm-hmm. It's about life experiences that put them in a situation where they're going to be experiencing more violence. So if we look at, for example, the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, one of the most robust studies on this, you'll find that women of color are overrepresented.
But it's a nuanced question, to say
it's a nuanced question.
To say the very least. Okay. Are there others from Rebuilding Hope?
Do you want to just
go
through?
Here we go. Yep, here we go. So do or how do communities normalize gender-based violence against Black victims and victims of color? What are some immediate things communities and providers can do to disrupt this?
I think we have to be really careful about, giving the impression that communities of color normalize this. I don't know any community that says, believes that this kind of conduct is okay. They certainly see it as problematic. I think what we are seeing is what I often call a political gag order. Oftentimes in communities of color, just like there are in many other communities where you just don't talk about it. Right. And again, I think that a lot of that has to do with stereotypes in the larger society, where you're so fearful of reinforcing those stereotypes. It's like, well, let's not reinforce this by acknowledging that it's a problem in our community, so then it doesn't get dealt with. Mm-hmm. And so people don't talk about it. So I think where we can sort of begin is to start having those conversations within communities of color in safe spaces where people can acknowledge, yes, this is happening, this is how it's showing up in our lives, and this is the unique way we need to deal with it in this, how it's showing up in our particular culture. Mm-hmm. And so again, as I said, all of this thrives on silence, secrecy, and shame. And if we could put an end to that, we can be further along in terms of dealing with it. No,
be a big step forward. Is there a generational aspect to this, Dr. West? I'm wondering. People, a generation or two ago certainly didn't talk about these things. Is it becoming more acceptable, a little more acceptable, or is it a family thing? I mean, what's going on?
I think so. With the Me Too movement and all these social justice movements where people are just really acknowledging that this is happening, that this is a problem, that there's more help, but there still is an element of we don't do a very good job when survivors come forward and they get that victim blaming message that you won't be heard or you won't be believed. So we still have a lot of work to do.
All right. Okay. With no intentions to minimize the impact of violence on any victim or survivor, do or how can experiences of gender-based violence have different impacts on Black victims or victims of color than on white or white-appearing victims?
Okay, I teach an entire course on family violence, so it takes me a whole quarter to unpack that question. But the short answer is this. I think as I expand my research, I talked about widening the lens earlier in my talk, and I think what we need to start doing is understanding that at the center I have intimate partner violence. How is it different within communities of color? You know, we talked about non-fatal strangulation,
right,
reproductive coercion,
yes.
But we need to start asking, how do people of color oftentimes live in a web of trauma and violence that exacerbates the intimate partner violence? I think we're dealing with what we call historical trauma. I post all my articles on my website so people can read this in more detail if they would like to do that. What impacted my own family was that historical trauma. That's what I was getting at early in that video, that being a victim of Jim Crow, segregation and lynchings and all of that, that impacts your parenting and how you function as a human being. So understanding that historical trauma, and many ethnic groups have some history of historical trauma. So institutional violence, when you go seek help from, for example, the police or some other institution, and then you're arrested or treated badly, that's a form of institutional violence that impacts that. Structural violence in the terms of poverty, homelessness, that's a form of violence. And that impacts it. Communities of color are also experiencing higher rates of community violence, other types of violence within their family, like child abuse, cultural violence, all those stereotypes about communities of color. The bottom line is all of those things converge to exacerbate the violence that is happening within the home. And to further add to that, COVID. I think we're all living with the trauma of COVID. We have no idea how that's going to shape this culture going forward. I think it's going to be many years and decades of then, in fact, looking back to see how COVID has impacted us in our communities.
This is something that has been, as you mentioned during your talk, secrecy, shame, let's put it in the corner, and then COVID, we're all isolated, all at home. You can't talk to anybody, can't see people.
Can't access services, can't access help. And we really had to redo our whole culture in terms of how we educate people, how we provide help for victims of domestic violence. And this is a really good report, the measuring the economic impact of, and what we know is that before COVID hit, people of color were economically disadvantaged. And during COVID, it made it harder to leave. Because if you were a person of color, if you were a Black or brown woman, you just simply had fewer economic resources. And the women who had fewer economic resources, guess what? They were more likely to stay because they could not leave. And so that's a type of structural violence, economic violence. And so the economy has made a big impact, and even more disturbing for me as an educator, that survivors of color were more likely to discontinue their education as a result of COVID because they did not have the economic resources to continue their education, which then makes it harder to leave an abusive relationship. So the point is that we've got to look at not just intimate partner violence, but all the types of violence that exist in the lives of people of color as we process this.
Right. Another question, does research demonstrate any specific considerations or responses that Black survivors and survivors of color may need for healing services, victim services, community/human services, as well as from criminal, legal, medical, and social service systems?
Okay. The short answer is yes.
Okay.
And a slightly longer answer that I can't unpack all to here is where I'm moving with my research, and I've actually done several technical assistance reports that we'll be releasing next year to work with advocates around how to work with these communities of color. The answer is what we need for all survivors, and particularly communities of color, is that whatever we have to do, it's got to be survivor-centered. It's got to be individualized and survivor-centered. We have to be talking to people. What does that survivor need? Not what do we need. Here's what our organization provides here. No, good luck. No, it's got to be survivor-centered. What does that person need to be healthy and whole, to escape from the violence? We need to be listening to survivors and hearing their stories and honoring their stories. So it's got to be based on what that survivor needs, what their unique needs are. Sometimes it's not just, sometimes you just need money to get your car fixed. Or you need money moving expenses. Or you need money to, for daycare or something. It's something as simple as that that could profoundly change somebody's life. So we need to be listening to survivors. So it's got to be survivor-centered. It's got to be culturally responsive. It can't be a one-size-fits-all kind of solution. It's got to be trauma-informed. We can't just act like domestic violence or sexual assault is the only form of trauma that that person has experienced. They've experienced numerous other forms of trauma as well. So it's got to be making sure we're addressing all the forms of trauma in their lives. And it's got to be strengths-based. So understanding that survivors are coming with all kinds of resilience and making sure that we're building on that and not just seeing them as damaged goods.
Right. Okay, to what extent is there a duality between BIPOC victims also facing disproportionate rates of criminalization and incarceration for behaviors and crimes stemming from their victimization? You know, this is what you were talking about just a few moments ago, right?
Right, exactly. That communities of color are oftentimes criminalized. And also, what ends up happening is that survivors oftentimes commit crimes in order to try to extricate themselves from domestic violence. So you may go and shoplift because you're trying to get money in order to get someplace to stay, or your perpetrator is taking all the money and you can't pay the rent or something of that nature. So people are criminalized for a lot of reasons. And we know in the criminal legal system a disproportionate number of people who are incarcerated have a background of domestic violence and sexual assault, which has brought them into the legal system to begin with. So in part of my community engaged work, I started to work with the YWCA. And this young woman in the picture, her name is Marissa Alexander. And she was in Florida around the time, was that young man who was shot by the police?
Trayvon Martin?
Yes. And the perpetrator said, well, he was standing his ground or something. But we realized those stand your ground laws didn't really apply to battered women. You couldn't stand your ground in your own home. The laws didn't really seem to apply to them very much. And so she fired off a couple of warning shots against her perpetrator, didn't hit anybody. And they wanted to give her 25 years in prison for that. And here was an individual, her perpetrator had beat up like 4 of his baby mamas, all of the mothers of his children, he had battered them. He had beat her when she was pregnant. She was severely fearful of him and fired off these warning shots. But because she used a weapon, she was facing decades in prison as a result of that. And we started to look around and realize that in our own community, women are also facing something similar. So this program, Survivors First, facilitating information resources for survivors of trauma, my colleague Doris O'Neill called, and she was like, "Hey, Dr. West, what are you doing?" I said, "Well, I guess I'm not doing anything, so I guess I'll help you too. So let's do something."
I got nothing going on, why not?
Yeah, I said, this is a problem, we gotta fix it. And so we're getting funding and getting this up and going, and then talking to the women in this program. Here's one quote from a woman. She said, "My partner had jumped on me before and threatened to kill me. I went to the hospital because of my injuries. This time I picked up a box cutter to defend myself. I remember we talked about women of color using aggression and self-defense. I went to jail for felony harassment. I lost everything. I lost my job, my apartment, my furniture, and my car. My baby was put in foster care when he was only 6 days old. Now I'm considered a felon, and it's going to make it hard for me to get a job." So what we understand, when people are criminalized in this way, and particularly if you're charged and convicted, you stay in jail longer, you lose your job, you got a criminal record, you can't find housing, you may lose your children. You're traumatized because you've been victimized, and now you're thrown and you're incarcerated. So we have to look at the intersections between criminalization and domestic violence and make sure that we're not further traumatizing individuals who are really victims. So the Survivors First program, just trying to figure out, is there a way we can provide services? And maybe some people don't need to be arrested and incarcerated. Maybe we need to figure out, well, what services do you need so we can avoid this for you?
Okay.
And so I guess I'll just, the last point I would make about that is working with survivors who have been arrested and incarcerated is hugely important to me. And this was an individual working with her and seeing I don't talk about any of the cases that I work on, it's all confidential, but for some reason this case made the paper, so it became public knowledge. And so, this battered woman, immigrant, no resources, and also looking at the impact of sexual violence, domestic violence, all the forms of violence that an individual can experience, and working together as a community resources in her particular community to talk about that and to try to explain to the legal system why she did what she did. Mm-hmm. So I think we can make, and I'm not in any way minimizing anybody's use of violence and saying it's okay for you to shoot at people or stab people or any of that. But I'm just saying we need to look at the context of why that is happening. And I think the last question I got, this was the last one that came prior to.
Sure. A general statistic referenced is that 60% of victim advocates nationally identify as white, and well over 60% of professionals in social work and social services nationally identify as white. What impacts could racial diversity in victim services and social services professionals, increase and lack thereof, have on current and future victim survivors of gender-based violence who do not identify as white? So we're talking about cultural sensitivity, right? I mean, that's...
Yeah, I think I'm all about creating a multicultural alliance of advocates and professionals and people within the community, because this is an everybody problem. It's not just like a people of color problem. And I don't believe that your ethnicity can preclude you in being helpful when working with survivors. But I think what we need to do is we just need to we need that cultural sensitivity, responsiveness training so we can do it effectively and not do more damage. And that means unpacking your own trauma and your own internalized racism and all of those things that would prevent you from being a good advocate to be able to do that work. But it also means that we have to get more people of color in the field doing the work. We need more research, definitely, and we need more, our Sisters House, for example, other organizations that are culturally specific, and we need to do more training, we need to do more outreach to communities of color and saying this is a movement and an important topic that you need to be at the forefront of advocating within your community to deal with. And so I oftentimes, like in my own faith community, will do workshops and talk about domestic violence and say, hey, this is an issue, we need to unpack this and try to get more people involved. The Women of Color Network does that. They actually work with advocates of color to support them so that they stay in the field and continue to do the work. So we just have to do better in that regard.
Right. Okay.
So, do we have any questions from?
We've got questions from the audience, absolutely. Very good questions, in fact. Or we still got one more from, Yes. If you could leave a single or handful of general recommendations to leave audiences, today's audience with, what would it be, keeping in mind that there's a variety of individuals joining us today, from high school students, youth college students, system and community professionals, et cetera?
I would say get educated, which is what we're trying to do here today. Learn as much as you can. That definitely helps. Get involved. I mean, that really changed my life, is getting involved with community organizations and partnering in order to make the changes that you want to see. And definitely just breaking the silence. I think we don't talk enough about all forms of violence. Again, like I always say, it seems to thrive on silence, secrecy, and shame. And you would just be so surprised at how many people have had to grapple with this issue in some capacity or another. And when you bravely share whatever story it is, you give other people permission to share their stories as well. And if we can sort of break that silence, that can go a long way. And people understand that they're not alone in this, this problem.
So here's a very personal question from a member of the audience, and it's along these same lines. How would you advise someone who is not a trained professional to support a friend or acquaintance who regularly hints at surviving sexual violence or trauma?
How would you support them? The three things I just mentioned, for sure. If you're not really trained, you also don't want to end up, creating additional problems, because oftentimes we live with a lot of stereotypes about who is victimized and why. And so you could really say something or do something that could shut that person down and do further harm. So I would say figuring out, if you're hearing things, sometimes it's helpful to just ask people directly, is there something you really want to talk about? And sometimes just opening the door gives them permission that, hey, here's a safe person that maybe I can talk about that, and they're at least willing and open, and making sure that you have resources. So I think all of us need to, for example, medical providers, whoever's doing work out there in the community, having information at your desk and in your vicinity, or a poster or something about like the domestic violence helpline or these kind of resources just sitting around. And that opens up conversations. Things that I've seen over the years that seem to work, like the bathroom projects, for example. And on the stalls in the restrooms, that's one place everybody gets to go. And where you can sometimes get away, if you're in an abusive relationship, away from your perpetrator. And then there are signs about human trafficking or sexual assault, or here's a number to call. And people can memorize those things. And so that's a way, so finding creative ways in the community to educate. But if you are just a regular person and wanting to help, making sure that you have access to resources in the community, and you can share that if you don't feel like I can personally help, but here's a place that can. For years when I moved here, I had the domestic violence helpline number on a bumper sticker on the back of my vehicle. And I just took so much pleasure out of knowing that just driving to work, I'm educating people and pissing off a lot of people. That just made my heart happy.
A follow-up on that. So people have to be ready to provide or to offer suggestions, but they also have to be ready when someone is ready to talk, do they not? I look out in the audience, I see Kelly Robinson from our sister's house here. We did a wonderful podcast with her, and she pointed out that somebody might not be ready to talk the first time or the second time, and then you said, well, they're not going to do anything. I'm not going to help them, you know. But the third or fourth or fifth time, they might be, right? And so we need to be there for them. Can you speak to that? Is that?
I can. I think that's where the education piece comes in, understanding the dynamics of domestic violence and sexual assault. Sometimes people don't even recognize that they've been victims. Sometimes it can really literally take years before people even have the language to talk about what happened to them. I mean, I didn't think, you know, when I was in graduate school, it's like, well, this is just what people have to experience. And this is just a thing that happens. But I wasn't running out embracing, like, this is sexual harassment or this is a problem, because that was just too much to deal with. So it takes a while sometimes, a little bit of healing and distance, and having somebody who you describe the experience to sometimes even tell you, that shouldn't have happened, that was wrong. And so understanding those dynamics, it may take survivors of intimate partner violence, they may leave as many 7, 9 times before they're willing to finally make a break because of that cycle of violence. And you get back together and you think it's gonna get better, and you have hope. And it may take really a good long time. So understanding how those dynamics play out are huge.
All right, thank you.
Patience.
Patience. Here's another great question. Have you worked with children from homes of domestic violence? And if so, how does it affect kids?
It can have a profound impact. I think some people can certainly have those life challenges, and they are certainly resilient, and they're very committed to not being violent. And I oftentimes see people who then dedicate, I think that's what brings many of us into this work in the first place, because of some early trauma. But we know it can be profoundly impactful. So people may develop substance abuse issues, depression, self-esteem issues, or be destructive in all manners of different ways, have difficulty parenting because of those experiences. But they may not know right away what it's linked to because they don't make those connections. So that's why I think about primary prevention. We have to prevent it from happening so people aren't traumatized. And when kids have these traumas, we have to be prepared to step in so they don't recreate that trauma for other people.
Right.
And then turn and victimize other people because they don't know another way of being in the world.
That's what they saw, right? That's what they saw. So it becomes intergenerational. With the issue of abortion rights, which is certainly timely, how should we address the issue of pregnancy control? Oh.
Are there any easy questions?
I've been looking, Dr. West. I can't find any. I can't find.
That is incredibly difficult to unpack. And I've actually been working with the American Psychological Association on some things around mental health and abortion because I think we as mental health providers are going to have to unpack that. I guess the short answer is we're going to see how big a problem domestic violence and sexual assault is in this country when people don't have access. And we're going to see, because pregnancy does happen in the context of sexual violence, and it can and it does on a regular basis. So part of it is we're going to have to do a better job with rape exams, gathering evidence so that we can deal with these cases. We're going to have to be in the schools educating about sex education so that people understand sexual violence and basic biology. It's horrifying to me when people who are making laws don't seem to understand basic biology. It's pretty deeply disturbing to me. So we're going to have some pretty robust conversations about sex and sexuality and reproductive health care. And we're going to have to be talking to survivors about the full range of reproductive choices and making sure that people have access. So that may mean terminating pregnancies, it may mean adoption, it may mean parenting, and it also means that if we're going to ask people to parent under the most difficult circumstances, we need to have a robust social safety network in place so that these children and families will have the best shot of having a healthy life as they can.
So you're suggesting that this is going to play out over many years, probably.
Decades.
Right? And we're not going to see the full effect of the Dobbs decision for quite a while.
I think we're starting in some ways to see it now when we see 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds who are pregnant and can't access reproductive health care. And what will we do with those survivors? I think we're going to be in for some very challenging times as we figure out how to best support those individuals.
I'm still looking for the easy questions in there.
Help us, sister.
As a person who has not been directly involved in race and gender-based violence, I somehow feel as if I cannot serve or support work to repair or resolve these issues. After all, who am I to step in this space? I am not a survivor, but how can someone like me be part of the solution?
Everybody can be a part of the solution. Everybody, this is a human problem, and everybody can be a part of the solution. And I would say that part of the solution is being willing to make mistakes and be vulnerable and be human. I try to be an advocate to people in the lesbian, gay, trans, queer community, and how many times have I messed that up? But I just keep showing up and keep trying and making myself available to call, allow people to call me out when I get things wrong. And so that's how you show up in that way, is to say, I just want to be here to help, and I'm going to mess it up. And tell me when I mess it up, and let's work together to try to fix it. And that's where the intersectionality comes into place, that when you bring all of who you are and you're willing to see all of who that person is, you can at least have a conversation. So I think that the people who helped me the most when I was dealing with my sexual harassment experience in graduate school, they weren't people of color, but they were willing to show up. And they were willing to have that conversation and have the conversation about race and all of the things that I wanted to talk about. So I would not shy away from that. And so whatever population I'm working with, I've worked with Cambodian refugees and Native women and, Mexican immigrant women. I wasn't an expert on any of those cultures either, but yeah, I got my library card. I can go do some reading about it. And I can also say, am I missing something here? Help me out, help me to understand it from your perspective too. So I would encourage that person not to feel like they can't be a part because of who they are.
If they come to it with an open mind and an open heart and a willingness to learn, those are the big steps, right? Dr. West, do you have any comments about navigating mandatory reporter status when students are about to disclose or are actually disclosing reproductive information, or reportable information, reportable information?
Students?
Yes, when students are about to, so I think this may be a UWT.
I think we're going to see more of that. And it's really challenging because I believe in Idaho, they're actually telling faculty members, for example, you cannot even talk about birth control or where to access birth control, where to access, abortion services.
Wait, back up now. Hold on. What did you just say? You can't talk?
You cannot share that information with students. I don't know if that law will pass or not, but there has been a discussion of that. And so if somebody is going to come and talk about, because that may there may create legal problems because we can't share that information. So I think that people are afraid altogether. So if a student comes to me and they're disclosing that and they want to have a conversation about the full range of how all that impacts them, I would feel very uncomfortable not being able to have that conversation. But I used to teach human sexuality classes. I teach a course on sexual deviance. That's a story behind how that happened. But as well as a full range of human sexuality, sexual violence. Students can come to my office and talk, and they do, come to my office and talk to me about anything. And I think part of it, I just have flyers on my door about sexual assault and domestic violence and helplines and that kind of thing. And I think just being that person who students feel comfortable doing that with, but also being familiar with the resources on campus if you really feel like, okay, this is out of my bandwidth, I don't have the capacity to do this, at least send them to the counseling center, or there are other resources on campus that they can draw on. And I've actually walked students over to campus security or the counseling center or wherever I felt like they needed to be to get immediate assistance at that particular time is a way how I would handle that.
Okay. Here's a good one. Cultural beliefs of our clients is something we can't control. For some folks, it can be hard for survivors to leave these domestic violence situations because of cultural beliefs. Mm-hmm. How can we advocate for healthier relationships while maintaining respect for cultural differences and beliefs?
by maintaining respect for cultural differences and beliefs. I think it's pretty simple. I mean, I think sometimes in the movement, the assumption is leaving is always the best option or the only option. And the reality is sometimes the violence will escalate when the survivor leaves. So they really need safety planning in place. But if it is not a part of their culture, particularly if you're in an immigrant community or it's an insular community, to leave that means leaving everything behind, and that just feels like not an option. Right. And it's a collectivistic culture that tells you it's not just all about you, but also about your family and in protecting that community. That may be a heavy lift. So talking about with that individual, if they're choosing to stay or leaving doesn't seem to be an option, it doesn't mean it never will be. It may not be right now. What they need to do, how can we maintain safety in the context of where they are at that moment and respecting the choices they make? Because you can't really mobilize people if they don't feel respected and if you don't really understand or respect their culture.
Okay. How can we help survivors when police and legal systems, other words, judges, commissioners, and so forth, become a barrier for relief?
Part of it is I try to do more education with judges, the legal community about dynamics of domestic violence. And we have to also educate survivors about, if they use force in self-defense, what are some of the legal consequences of that? And so part of it is changing the system. And that's what we're trying to do with survivors first. But definitely we need to, I like to think that people in the legal system, although the legal system isn't always set up in the way perfectly to help survivors, that individuals who work in the system are at least open to education. So educating those professionals is going to be critical, because I don't think that they want to be a part of re-victimizing people.
Right. The criminal justice system is overwhelmed, somebody might say. The criminal justice system is overwhelmed. How could we possibly personalize the situation to meet the needs of this
particular individual? I will hope at some point we can move beyond understanding that it's more than a criminal legal problem and assuming the criminal legal system can fix this. This is a social problem, and we need all social services involved to deal with the problem. So sometimes people need mental health care, they need medical care, they need financial resources. So not just thinking the legal system can come in and fix a very complicated problem, right, because we're sometimes sort of putting police in a position to fix problems that social workers or other professionals need to address. So we're sort of putting, police aren't designed to be marriage counselors or, to kind of fix the long-term problem or to fix housing or fix mental health. So we need a community engaged way of dealing with the problem.
You talked earlier about breaking down silos, and that's exactly what we're talking about here. It can be difficult, however, because of politics, obviously.
Money.
Thank you. So how do you navigate those barriers? How do you start those conversations when they're so complex? There's territory that's being defended. How do you navigate that?
Well, I'm sort of a free entity, so I can move between these organizations, so that really helps too. But I think cross-training really, really helps too. So talking to the domestic violence organizations about sexual violence and sex trafficking. I mean, I see every case that I've worked on, all of those forms of violence are interwoven. So it goes back to intersectionality. And I love with the Justice Center, the Crystal Judson, you can go there for one-stop shopping to help you get whatever resources that you need, that certainly helps as well. But we do have to start talking to each other and stop being, because we can't ask survivors to divide themselves. Oh, well, you're a survivor of sexual assault, so you can't use my services, you need to go over
down the
here. No, we have to partner. And that's what we're doing too with Survivors First. It's like, okay, what do you need? Survivor-centered, and crafting those services for them.
Okay. All right, we're cruising into near the end of our program. Dr. West, I have a few parting words that I need to say, but would you like to leave us with any thoughts as we begin to ramp down?
I guess what I would say is we can all make a difference in this. This is an everybody problem, although it disproportionately impacts certain communities of color in different ways. It's okay to be having those conversations, as uncomfortable as they are, in that you can be a part of helping somebody in ways that, profound ways that you don't even realize. So just be that person that a survivor can come to, and that you're open and willing to help in whatever less than perfect way it may seem to at the time, to be that person. And you can really change a life. And together we can really change this community. And I've seen it happen.
And she's helping make it happen. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Carolyn West. Thank you to the audience for contributing your questions and for joining us today to expand your learning journey about these issues. We hope your journey doesn't end here. All the forms of violence spoken of today impact each of us directly or indirectly. They are not an individual issue, as we've heard, but rather a community crisis. It takes each of us to continuously and intentionally seek education. Excuse me. From there, we can best advocate for change, solutions, and services that can support survivors towards their path of healing. We can also rally for systemic change that can disrupt cycles of oppression and violence. So now, as we close, please consider how you can best listen, learn, and engage as an individual, friend, family member, student, professional, and community member. Reach out for support if your life or the life of a loved one has been impacted by violence and or trauma. You deserve and can have support. Oops, hold on, sorry. Technological problem. Be an advocate for change wherever you hold spaces or networks of influence, and for the organizations that show up every day to prevent violence from happening and to support survivors throughout their lives. Learn how you can best serve their missions by volunteering your time, capacity, talent, or resources. If society, as a collective, is responsible for creating and contributing to these issues, together we can also be the solution to deconstructing them. Thanks again to Dr. West for sharing with us today. It's been a pleasure and a joy to be with you. We thank the University of Washington Tacoma Office of Community Partnerships for hosting this event, live streaming and recording it, and thanks to Rebuilding Hope, our sister's house, the Crystal Judson Family Justice Center, and Washington Trafficking Prevention for collaborating to present this forum today, and also a big thanks to Carlin Sampson, who made this thing happen. It's a fantastic job. Thank you so much. Have a great afternoon.
We should be off live stream right now.